So for the next of the Catapult High Performance Practitioner Interviews, we're at Leeds Trinity University. There's a really exciting summit taking place here, which is a joint function between Leeds Trinity and Australian Catholic University. One of the speakers is Professor Craig Twist from University of Chester. And Craig's kindly agreed to come along and give us the benefit of some of his insights into both the academic side of his role and the applied side. So I think, thanks very much for coming along, Craig.
Welcome.
Really appreciate it. Just as an opener, it would be really useful just to see how you perhaps, I know your full-time role is as an academic, but how you work the role such that you also operate in the applied world as well.
Yeah, I've been at Chester for 14 years now. Prior to that, I started off in further education, but also had a role with S&C. So I spent 5-6 years working with Great Britain and Ireland students and did a few tours overseas, but sort of moved then towards sort of academia more. But as it stands now, as you say, I'm full-time at Chester and I've been now for 14 years and lead a small group there, which is our interest more around sort of applied physiology of team sports, and in particular rugby. But alongside that, we have a number of students that are funded by various sort of clubs and organisations, and my job's to supervise them, but as part of that, I'm working with a number of those clubs, looking at translating the sort of work that we do for them, and then trying to get that into practice.
And I know Chester pretty well, because I studied there myself. I think it's a lovely little institution. And perhaps one of the, I guess, the advantages of the place is it's quite a small institution by comparison to some of the others, so it creates quite a nice, I guess, quite a nice culture to cultivate these people that you're bringing on board, the applied practitioners. Yeah,
I mean, we're fairly well located, but as I said at the start, 14 years there now, and you do see a lot of movement normally from academics, but I've been there because it is a nice place to be. We're well located, and within the sort of the organisations that I work with is within fairly easy reach. But one of the big pluses is that we've got a department there that have got a real nice balance, I think, between the teaching and developing some real good young applied academics that are going out there as practitioners and working at English Institute of Sport, in various rugby league clubs, rugby union, football. So they're getting the applied element on a number of programmes that we run. But we've also got a really applied research group as well, and I think the two marry together really well, and we're under no real pressure to sort of bring in, so go down a health route, and we're allowed to sort of do the type of stuff that we really enjoy doing and we think has an application to sports performance.
So obviously you've got this broad range of areas that you work, but I guess to the majority of people that know you as somebody who's quite intrinsically involved in rugby league. I mean, how did the interest in the association with league come about?
Well, like a lot of things, I started playing as a kid from St Helens originally. Wasn't a great player, and at some point, sort of through my degree, I was involved in playing, but I got an opportunity at the end of, just as I started my masters actually, so as I said before, worked with the Great Britain and Ireland students. And a guy called Vinny Webb, who sort of took me under his wing as a coach, but really allowed me to sort of develop, and I sort of learnt a lot from those 5 years of being involved. We toured Australia, I think 3 times, New Zealand once, France, and it was a real opportunity for me to sort of develop some of the things that I'd learned in my masters and my degree, but really to put them into practice in a real world environment. I then got a little bit involved with the RFL. So when they first started the camps up at Ampleforth, so I was involved in that in a sort of role with Nick Alafihi. So we were doing work then on profiling, so a lot of the scholarship kids that were coming through. So we were involved in that, so I was sort of advising on that and doing a lot of applied work in terms of S&C delivery, but also looking at, as I said, the profiling side of things. So we did a few years where I was involved in that, and then funnily enough, through rugby, I met a PhD supervisor, a guy called Roger Eston, and Roger sort of, again, was a real good mentor for me, and I actually went down a slightly different route with a PhD. But when I came back out of that, I've been involved with various clubs, but luckily enough that as a St Helens lad, I know quite a lot of the lads that are at Saints, and we started doing some work there back in 2010 when I'd been at Chester for a few years. And it was initially sort of with GPS and around that, and then since then it's really developed, and we've had a couple of student placements, and I've sort of worked with Matty Daniels and Nathan Mill, and people there over the last few years, and they've been there a while now, and that's been really beneficial for us because we've been able to implement quite a bit there. So that's sort of been for the last, I would think, 8-9 years, been quite a lot of the work is that we've managed to sort of develop. And I think it was sort of emergence of GPS technology and sports science itself becoming more sort of, there's a bigger uptake in the sports. And I sort of said, as an ex-player and knowing people, it's been helpful to sort of then translate that into the actual applied and research side.
I'm guessing that, I mean, the world of professional sports is a pretty brutal place to be.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to take a long-term view to a lot of these things. And you're talking about engaging with these people from a research perspective, where it's understood that really the benefits won't be shown for some period of time. I'm guessing that Rugby League's been really open in that respect and quite understanding and patient, I guess, with regards to this.
Yeah, I certainly, you find that with certainly with all the students that go in that maybe in other sports, they say that openness is certainly there. It's a sport that hasn't got a great deal of money, but they are sort of willing to sort of try new things, and they want to learn. So you are given that access that you might not get in other professional sports, and I think part of that is having the right group. Now I'm not saying that it's we've had some success, but we've also had quite a few sort of things that have fallen flat. Yeah. Simply because we just as you well know, trying to implement some of the stuff that we do in a research setting, trying to translate that across is really difficult. But yeah, certainly there's an openness there, and that's really helped. And I think a part of that is because there is a lack of money there. So there's a quid pro quo in the sense that they're getting something from you while you're also getting something from them in terms of the access. So it's getting that balance between the two. As I say, sometimes it always doesn't translate into a real clear outcome, but there is that dialogue between both parties, and both seem to be getting something from it. Yeah.
So the fact that they see that they're getting something from it would suggest to me then that they're actually a part of actually determining the direction that the research goes. So essentially coming up with the performance questions that you're addressing. Would that be the approach you'd take?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. I think there's always a challenge really, because as academics we're sort of governed by things like ref and from our paymasters and it's all about high impact sort of papers, but that doesn't necessarily always translate. So there is sometimes there's been a bit of a conflict there between what we're trying to achieve and some of the things that we're trying to implement, as well as sort of what the club want. But I think first and foremost, from my personal point of view, is we've always got to come out with something that is actually has an application to the game and actually improves the behaviour, that has impact, if you like. Okay. So yes, I think that in answer to your question, they're always the ones that will come to us with some things that they want to answer. Sometimes those things not necessarily what, as I say, from a more research perspective are, interesting and desirable, but I think ultimately you've got to have some outcome that I think is a big thing for me, is the impact of it.
And I'm guessing then, them coming to you with a question where they're looking for an answer. I mean, we're both aware that in sport and in research, the answer very often isn't binary. It's not yes or no, but there are degrees to which you can say with confidence, yes, if you do this, that might happen. I wonder if you've got any kind of examples of the sort of work you've undertaken, and then how you've gone and implemented that or attempted to implement it in practice in the clubs.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff we've done around profiling, and I think the interpretation of that data and how we use it. So I think one of the things that has become really apparent, and that's probably because of the time I've spent with different scientists, if you like, that have got different outlooks, and not just physical scientists like myself, but social scientists who look at some of that data in a slightly different way. And we can collect those numbers, but actually then translate it and getting people to understand it. So we've tried to look and, as I say, take sort of lead from other disciplines as well. And it's not necessarily always a one discipline approach. Yeah. So an example is we've started to look at some of the profile that we do in the monitoring. But one of the things we found is that it depends very much on the context of that data, and are you winning, losing, who's there, who's watching. So we started to see very different responses from some athletes when there were different personnel around them. And then the problem with that then is, well, why is that? And also then is that you having confidence to be able to interpret those numbers that, well, how do we know that that's a true, value? Because it could depend very much on the context. So we have started to do an approach where we've done some of the basic monitoring that we do. But from a research point of view, we got access with one club, and we actually looked at doing it with in and out of different conditions. So one with just the sports scientists there, collecting the data. We then did another trial where we did the same battery of tests, but we put head coaches and other people around there. We actually found a difference. They were better when the head coaches were there. Yeah. But then what we've now done is we've actually interviewed the players, the coaches, in an attempt to try and understand what are they wanting from that data, how do they use that data, why is it of interest to them, why did they perform different. So we actually showed them some of the players, the scores. Yes. Why did you perform differently? So it's trying to get a bigger understanding rather than just simply coming in, like you say, saying, yes, no, there's the data. I think we've got to understand it a little bit in a lot more detail. And as I said, within the context of how that data is being collected and how it's being interpreted.
I'm guessing, my experience of working with football players is they are very, very wary of a situation where information is being collected, and you have to ensure that they don't feel like they're just guinea pigs that are being used for the benefit of your own research. So the relationship that you establish with these guys is absolutely critical, I guess.
Oh, fundamental. I learned that pretty early on. They're not pieces of meat, but sometimes they can be treated like that. And as soon as you start to go down that route, you start to lose any credibility. Using the data, you end up becoming, you're just providing the bullets basically for the coaches, and that's the last situation you want to be in. And to any sort of young sports scientists, I do this with them. I do a role play session with my master's students and put them in various situations like that. And we were talking earlier about some ways in which sports science is developing into we're collecting lots of data. But I think one of the biggest skills is actually understand how we can actually use that and use it in a way that's both informative, sensitive to the individual and meaningful. Otherwise, we just end up collecting reams and reams of data for no apparent reason. So I think you've got to learn very quickly that whatever you're collecting has got to be done in a sensitive way. But it's also got to have some meaning in terms of how you translate that.
And that's a consistent point that's come up in a number of these interviews recently, where we're all conscious that the world of sports science is growing. There's increasing numbers of opportunities for young people to go in there. And I think a lot of universities are doing a fantastic job in preparing people with the hard skills and the knowledge to go into these places. But what's coming back from a lot of sports and a lot of organisations is, yes, these people are coming in with all of the knowledge, all of the skills, but it's the soft skills and it's the capacity to interact appropriately with players, with coaches and the like that seems to be somewhat missing. I'm just wondering what steps you might take to try and bridge that gap and ensure that your students are going into these places adequately prepared, I guess, with the social skills as well.
I think it's certainly got to be part of the programme, and we've tried to do that in Chester in the last few years. We've developed, various masters programmes and undergraduate programmes, but a big part for us is, they need to be good scientists first and foremost. Yeah. We need that, but we've got to develop those, as you say, those softer skills in them as well. So, as I said before, we do a particular module in our master's programme where it is very much focused around that and putting them in situations where they certainly feel uncomfortable. And some of them really struggle with that first off, because I think that they just want to collect data, work in a lab, and they think it's just as easy as that. But the challenge comes when they've had to sit in front of, and we bring people in. So we actually bring coaches in, we bring employers in, and we do one-to-ones with them, and we get them to sort of be put in those situations. We're also quite insistent that our students get some practical experience while they're with us. Yeah. And we put them with people. It's a structured programme that we get them out there, and we've got certain things that we want them to experience. And we sit them down, we discuss with them afterwards, we feedback and say, look, we want you to reflect on some of the things that you're doing, but we do put an emphasis on that, because otherwise you say we just end up with these robots that will collect data or, collect GPS data, body composite, whatever you need, but they don't know how then to translate that and use it, and then be in situations where, that can be quite uncomfortable, where, a player really objects or a coach just starts to use the data in a completely inappropriate way. But so how again, unless you've experienced that, you're going to struggle to deal with it. So I think it's fundamental that, you know, you can teach some of it, but some of it you can't teach. I mean, some of the situations I've been in, which I've on occasion when I've had students out in placement, you know, I've come back and I'm thinking, I'm going to lose my job here, you know, because, you know, this student was back and complains. But
yes.
I've had a department who just turned to me and said, look, so that's the reality, and you're giving them real world experience there, you know. But and that is the hard, like you say, it is brutal. It's harsh reality. So, you know, sometimes we can't. You know, I was reading this thing on the snowflake generation, you know, and sort of wrapping them together. But, you know, if you want to go into performance sport, you know as well as anybody is that it's so cutthroat. So they do have to be exposed to that as part of that training process.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Just switching back to the research then. Obviously, you've spent a number of years performing some fantastic work, which has been focused in and around rugby league. Just interested, really, where we are today, and what are the kind of the performance questions that are being thrown at you at the moment. You know, where's the research going currently?
I think for me, we've pretty much with the advance, so 10 years ago with GPS and the like, we sort of, I think we know what the game looks like now. I think from a recovery point of view, and that's what I'm talking about today actually, is again, we've got lots of data on that. I think that the question now is interpreting it and keeping it in perspective. So I think those things are pretty well established. We know what's going on. I think the interesting thing for me now in the next few years is looking at training and what these athletes are doing and what they need to do. Certainly from the junior ages and getting through, but also at senior level, how do we structure through the week? So some of the work we've done of late has looked at, with using about 7 or 8 clubs we've got data from. So we're looking across the season. And the similar data, Crustrup and the like have done the same in soccer, but we see this drop off towards the end of the season in physical, fitness. So certainly high intensity intermittent running drops off. Now anecdotally, we know that that's probably talking to the coaches is that there becomes this shift in emphasis as the year goes on, more towards training, less training load. It's more on sort of technical, tactical, patching them up. Again, wrapping them in buddable wrap because they want to get them to the end of the season. And there's this, what I've termed killing them with kindness, is that we're losing that training intensity as the year goes on, simply because they want to try and keep them fresh and they're playing games. So I think we need to sort of start to explore in a bit more detail what we can do with players, what we can't do, but in an attempt in training using these different approaches, both physically, but also I think some of the stuff that Jamie Heighton, who's a colleague of mine at Chester, has started to look at is looking at some of these sort of mental demands and the cognitive loading that we see in training. And whether we're getting, and again, we spoke with coaches, sort of the high level coaches, and saying, look, how can we best replicate some of the things that you want from them in games, but in our conditioning practices? So moving away from just sort of banal sprint interval training, the things we can do and manipulate that will get an added benefit, like cognitively as well, so under pressure situations. So I think for me, that's where we are at the moment and where we're moving towards. Trying to understand more about the training and preparing these athletes to go out and do what they do week in, week out.
So you mentioned a number of key aspects in terms of what constitutes a rugby league player there. So you've got the physical side, you're talking about the psychological or the cognitive or decision-making side of things, appropriate design of the training programs and what have you. I think over the past few years, and obviously I've been involved peripherally with rugby league myself, we have sent out national teams to compete in World Cups and tournaments against the Southern Hemisphere teams, and seem to always just come up slightly short. So obviously there's something that they possess down under within rugby league that we're just not quite matching. Have you got any thoughts as to perhaps the areas that we're a little bit light on?
I think physically, we're probably there. As the group that we have, our best sort of 17 players will match, an Australian, New Zealand team. But I think what they have is a week in, week out intensive a competition that we perhaps don't have. And within that comes that robustness of being able to go week in, week out and at that level and compete. I think there's a mental side to that as well. You read articles on teams like Melbourne Storm and some of the training that they do, and the players being able to tolerate prolonged periods of sort of high, back-to-back sets, things like that, is that you probably don't get them as often, these repeated high intensity efforts, as much in maybe Super League on a regular basis, whereas in the NRL, you're probably getting those, and I'd say the physical qualities are probably there, but being able to go again and again, I think there's we've done a little bit of work on things like pain tolerance, looking at these players that have got better pain tolerance, also seem to have, will push themselves more when we do run them to exhaustion intermittently. So there's some recent work being done by a group down at Kent that have shown that, not only do you get physiological adaptations with sort of this high intensity training, but you get an increased tolerance to pain. Now, I think that's something whereby if you're regularly being exposed to that and it's managed, I think, you'll get players that are able, when you get into the, 75th minute and it's back to back, you're ready to all, and you need to push. I think there's probably a bit more risk from the Aussie teams as well. They're prepared to risk a bit more in those, because there's a bit more confidence on, because they've been doing it regularly, where we might not see that. Teams have, there's been an argument from some arms that, the game's gone a bit boring over here. It's very defence orientated. Yeah. I think we're starting seeing now some teams that will throw the ball around. There's a bit of a risk there. So teams that will do that. And then I think one of the biggest underlying facts is they've just got a bigger pool to pick from as well, the Aussies.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, rugby league has always been viewed, I guess, as a northern sport, and I know we have a team from Catalan, and we've even got a team in Toronto that's been formulated now. But traditionally, it's really been a relatively small geographical area to choose from, and we've got Union that we're competing with as well. I suppose going forward, I mean, can you see a situation where participation in the sport might increase to a level that maybe will increase the pool sufficiently that we might compete?
I don't know. We need to do a little bit of work around that. That's personal opinion to do that. And I think one of the things is giving these young people, the numbers have dropped. We are struggling. We've got football, we've got rugby union, as you say, is a big factor, which has got some money behind it. Yeah. And they're investing that money in the sport, rugby union. Rugby league has not got the money, and as you say, it's very much a M62 corridor sport. We've tried to spread it, but in my opinion, I don't think we're trying to spread a very small talent pool. So I think as we move forward, the thing for me would be that we would need to look more at, looking what we can offer these young people as an incentive into the game, not just in terms of the development. And I think that's a big thing is, we need to have the right programmes in place to develop those young players from 13, 14. And there are some clubs doing some real good work in that, but we need to see more of that in terms of developing those young players from across, like you said, the heartlands of the game. Yeah. And getting them in those, but also education. What can we offer them? Not just in terms, largely working class areas. What can we do with these kids to give them some incentive to go? Once they finish, or if they don't make it. And if we start to see that, there might be some appeal of coming into the sport, because not only are you getting a good conditioning program and a skill program, but they also see educationally that there's going to be something there for them. Maybe when they get to the end. I've seen some good examples from some players that have gone through that program and have realised, look, they're smart enough to realise that I'm not in it forever, or it could end tomorrow. So they do some work there, and they go and get themselves some qualifications. And I think if we did more with that, we had more links, education, both at colleges and universities, and some of that's going on. Don't get me wrong, but I think if it was more obvious and there was a structure there, there'd be it would appeal to some of those young players coming in a little, and their parents as well, when they're looking for a career for the son or daughter. Okay. Yeah. But that's an important part as well. But for me, there's certainly got to be. We've got to look at, rather than spreading the game, I think we've got to focus on where it's strong at the minute and doing more with that. Yeah.
So something that we haven't seen a huge amount of in rugby as a whole, but there have been one or two quite high-profile cases, is an example where players have crossed codes, either from league to union, union to league, or one way and then coming back. Yeah. Is that something that you'd like to see more of? Is it something that we actually have there are physical reasons as to why it doesn't occur more, or are the games actually that different that it makes transition?
The games are completely different, and I think that's one of the biggest players trying to switch across. Obviously, we've had a few high-profile situations, we've seen, like you said, that haven't worked out. And I think certainly in certain particular groups, it's just difficult. Rugby union is much more technical, very position-specific, characteristics. Some work we did a few years ago now with Graham Close, his group down at John Moore's, we had looked at body composition and profiles of rugby league players. Apart from props, you're probably talking very similar characteristics across, because, in a game we've got not a large amount of money, we've got a salary cap. They want players that can move around in positions. So we saw centres that look like back row players, and and wingers that look like back row. So there's a lot of the coaches, I think, want that. In rugby union, you don't get that. Props, hookers, back row. So I think if you're trying to switch from league to the union, and having talked to some of the players that have done it, I think one of the biggest challenges is how technically challenging it is. Just to switch to a game that is, again, completely different. There's a different structure to it, and I think that rugby league players want the ball in the hand. They want to be able to run, and they want to be able to defend. Now, I'm not saying they don't do that, they just don't do it as much. And you find the breakdown, you find rucking, mauling is the better players in union are, technically excellent at that. And I think that to learn that, where they've been doing it since they were 7, 8, 9 in union, and coming across, I think in the other way around, union players coming across, I think where they struggle with that is just the speed of the game. You look at the sort of GPS trace between, you're talking maybe 9,500 metres a minute for league versus union. There's a lot more backward and forward movement in league, which is you're not getting in union. It's a lot more static. A lot more of the work is static work in rucking, mauling for the forwards. So I think it's really difficult for positions just to swap across because the games are so different.
So I guess you're probably saying that the likes of, say, Sonny Bill Williams is just a bit of an outlier, a bit of a freak in that respect.
Again, the position he's playing and the team he's playing in around, the style of play. So when we see teams, New Zealand play a particular type of rugby, it's very open, it's very expansive. And yes, Sonny Bill Williams is one of those players that is, he would fit in. He could probably adapt to other sports as well because he's just a good athlete, good hand-eye coordination, ball skills. But yeah, he's playing. I mean, Jason Robinson was another example. Players that can translate and have got lots of open space. They're not involved in the ruck, the maul to a great deal. So I think for me is certain positions, certainly forwards and halves maybe, will struggle with the transition between the two. Maybe your outside backs have probably got a bit more of a chance. Again, providing they're playing in and again, I think some players, if they want to have the ball in the hand or they want to, rugby union, they're probably going to see it less as they would do in league. So there's other things around it as well.
Okay. One final question, and put you on the spot again, just a little bit here. So, totally by chance, somebody passes away, an ex-Chester College student, and they've left £3 million for research into rugby league, and the money's put into your hands. How would you invest that to try and, I suppose, best benefit the future of the game?
Grassroots, because a game that's struggling, we've got to find ways of, like I said before, one is, I think some of that's got to be how we attract more young people into the game. Yeah. Then what we do with them when we get them in, both physically. I know some of that's work. We've done some work. I know Ben Jones at Leeds has done work on that, but I think we need to do a lot more around that. Is making those and making that across the game. In terms of coaching, so tactical, technical, physical as well. So developing those sides of it. But certainly then the other side of it is, what we can offer those young people when they're in the game. What we can do to bring them in.
Yes.
We also need to think about how we look after these young people, because we've had some incidences where we've had players that have been lost to the game for one reason or another. And I've said before, we have them at training maybe 2 hours a day. It's the other 22 where they're off and what they're doing. And again, maybe something more broadly, what we can offer to help these young people, which will be different to other sports that, that maybe some are doing it, but we've got a duty of care, I think, with these young people.
Right.
And I think that's something we've got to try and look to do. So that would be my sort of idea.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Craig, thanks very much
You're
for
welcome.
joining
Thanks
us
for
here
inviting me.
today.
Yeah.
I know you've got a busy day, you've got presentations
I have,
to
yeah.
give, so I'll say thanks very much.
Cheers.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.